Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome to the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode number 5. Tonight we're going to start our show, talk a little bit about what's happening on our farm, and then we're going to discuss how Josh both became an engineer and a farmer. I'm Morgan Hayes. I'm an assistant professor in Biosystems and Ag Engineering at the University of Kentucky, and my husband and I farm about 500 acres in Boyle County. We focus on a commercial cattle and hay operation there.
And I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in Ag Engineering, focusing on precision livestock farming. And I have a farm in Mercer County where we focus on raising Angus cattle and hay production as well.
Great. Well, thanks for being here with us. We're actually going to pre-record a couple of these Josh's and my stories because we have a couple of major conferences coming up in December, and we wanted to make sure that these got published in a timely fashion. But before we start, let's talk a little bit about what's happening here on the farm in the first couple weeks here in December.
In December, we're still, moving cattle. We're trying to make sure pretty much everybody's taken care of. So we have all the cows, make sure they've got plenty of good hay. So ensure that they're bred. Got a lot of calves on the ground, making sure that we have our creep feeders now out there with the calves. So just keeping everything in line for us is just machinery maintenance, and the cattle aspect is just pretty much what's on our list right now. How about yourself, Morgan?
Yeah, so we will have been doing some manure spreading over the past couple weeks, and also getting cattle starting to feed some hay to our spring calvers. And our fall calvers, of course, have been on hay for a couple weeks, making sure that they have good hay in front of them. Also, those cows get fed feed. Because we have a hay operation, a lot of our hay is sort of mediocre, nothing super poor, but not necessarily our highest quality hays get fed to our cows, and so we make sure we supplement with feed so those cows are getting fed every day. Also, that gives us a good chance to get eyes on a lot of calves, especially those younger calves, making sure there's no issues with mud and wear and tear on those little calves.
Yeah, we actually got a couple of ours we're putting in they go to our feeding barn, hay feeding barn at this point. So most of our cows, so probably 40 of them are going to be in the feeding barn.
Oh, that'll be nice.
Barn.
Yeah.
So that'll be good for them.
Winter feeding areas, any sort of winter feeding area is a good strategy to keep them out of mud. Fortunately, we're still pretty dry right now, but it's not going to last forever. We know how winters go here in Kentucky. So let's start today, though, Josh, with your story. So you are both an engineer and a farmer, as am I. And so why don't you start with I think your farming background maybe goes back a little bit further. So why don't you start with your farming background?
So the farming background, I was born and raised in Kentucky, and my farming background goes back to my initial, when I was 8 or 9 years old and started pretty much doing my 4-H projects with beef and sheep production. And so I always raised a market lamb over the summer. And at that point, I got my first crossbred calf. So I actually showed a half Angus, half Holstein cross as my first commercial heifer. So you can imagine how well I did in beef classes. But it was one of those, I loved that heifer, raised her up. And then at that same time, I also had a registered Angus heifer from Dad. And so I raised that heifer as well. And so slowly but surely over the years went from, having that one to a couple animals, and then the family farm, and just started doing more and more progression as we went through time. So by the time we were 20 or so, we were herdsmen of the year for the Angus Association for Kentucky. So my brothers and I.
Wow.
So it's just something that took a lot of years, a lot of work, and we do our own hay, and we do a lot of our own management there with the cattle. So it's just taking a small herd from on 35 acres and slowly expanding that operation.
So you started out, you said your family had 35 acres.
35 acres, yes.
And how, when you were 18 years old, how many acres do you think your family owned?
At that point, I think it was, we bumped up to probably about 100, almost 200. We were somewhere in the transition in there. So we'd gotten some adjacent land came up, and so it's one of those things, they don't make adjacent land that often, or doesn't come available too often. So a lot of those times we weren't ready to get it quite at that point, but we decided to go ahead and expand the operation because that's once in a lifetime opportunity sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, land doesn't come up very often. It is a struggle, especially if it's not priced the way you want to or you're not ready for it. But it is really important to consider distance when you're purchasing land and expanding operations. So, yeah, we have sometimes that same issue. We try and decide if we're purchasing or not. So I understand that. And then you went to college, but you guys continued farming while you were there. I know that.
Oh yeah, so we still stayed in the state of Kentucky, so we could still farm, and so some of that was just convenience, so we could be at home because we bred the cows. My brothers and I and Dad bred the cows, and so it was just a lot of that work was spread out over a couple of people. It makes it a lot easier. So if it's a family operation, it makes it a lot more easy, a lot more manageable, feasible. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good word there. A lot more feasible if we have a lot of people instead of relying all on one person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So.
But you didn't start out, because when I met you, Josh, you were not an engineer. In fact, this is a funny story, but I'll tell this to the audience here. When I started my master's, Josh and his twin brother were both in college. They were finishing up their bachelor's degrees, and his brother was an engineer. And I did not know this, but I took a beef science class with Josh, and I sat in the computer lab with his brother very often in the Barnhart building here on campus. And I kept seeing his brother and having conversations, and his brother looked at me like he had no idea who I was and why I was talking to him. And in fact, it's because I was having class with Josh and talking to him, and then I'd go into the computer lab and talk to his brother, and I did not know they were twins at the time. It was a little awkward for his brother Justin, awkward for me, embarrassing for me, but really uncomfortable for him because he had no idea why I was talking to him about cattle.
Yeah, it's as a twin, sometimes you roll with the punches, and so we just you didn't want to embarrass people, so you just kept going with it, and oh yeah, that's probably just a one-off thing. And then second time, and so third time, well, we're too far now to correct them, so we're too far. We'll just keep going with it. So. But yeah, I started out animal science. So I was with you in the beef production class with Thrift, and I did an undergraduate degree under Dr. Matthews, and so we was on cows eating grass, while I was endophytic fescue research. And so I had that interest going up pretty much through my master's work, and then at some point, I'd always been involved with the quarter scale pulling tractor team. And so at some point, I was able to take the opportunity to go on with them to a trip for precision ag to Brazil. And so getting that foot in the door with precision ag, and they changed me over with that. And so after that trip to Brazil, it was a 2-week trip. That really got me interested in precision ag practices and what all can be done.
And what did you see when you were in Brazil that really triggered for you? You said, this is what I want to work on.
There was a lot of it was sugarcane harvesters. It was just the size and the scope and how they used them down there. But it was just trying to utilize technology to overcome problems. And it was the sugarcane harvester, it was the coffee bean problems, and I wanted to do that same thing for livestock. So down there you had either 1 or 2 acre farms, or you had 50,000 acre farms. It was amazing. You didn't have really anything in between. It was very odd compared to here in Kentucky. But you had those huge farms, and they just a scale, and you're like, we need to address issues on our own farm using engineering practices. So that's kind of what got me interested in engineering. Then I came in here, worked for Dr. Montrose, and just got my foot in the door and started doing some work with some biomass. And I still had that interest for livestock. So I had that animal science background, but I still really wanted to do livestock.
Interesting. So you got your degrees were focused on animal science, and cattle specifically. And then you have a precision, which was more forage based, and then you sort of mesh those two into your current position.
Mesh those two, and actually had a postdoc position in between there, where I was actually able to get a grant through USDA just to get my postdoc. Was looking at kind of integrating different aspects. So it was a GIS aspect of, we know our pasture soil quality, we know certain things, we know the weather patterns. Is we need to kind of predict how we should be rotating pastures. So they had it originally, and then come to find out, they had done this work actually here at UK in the 1970s, 80s with the Grays program. So it was actually kind of an Excel. It was a computer, it was a pre-MATLAB program.
Right.
So, but some of that work, and then trying to build upon that. So that's kind of what I had in my postdoc, then transitioned to this position here.
Wow, that's really interesting. So what do you think is the benefit of being both an engineer and a farmer at the same time? Like, what to you is the benefit of having both backgrounds right now?
It's trying to look at it, for me, it's trying to approach it as a practical problem. There's a lot of practical problems that I feel like need to be addressed. And so trying to find, there are solutions, but cost-effective solutions. Because a lot of times there are so many demands on that dollar, trying to make that dollar stretch, for me, it's challenging at times for the farming operation to be its own separate entity. And so that's why I really focused on the scales, knowing the weight of your animals, knowing what you have in them to really manage the animals better.
Yeah, I think that's important, that the economics as a farmer really come into play. And sometimes it's very easy to tell people what the solution is, but if the solution is not reasonable, it's never going to get implemented.
And that was always something when I'd go to the meetings and, they'd have solutions. And it's like, well, I don't want to spend $100,000. This is just, not a real example, but I don't want to spend all that money. Is there something I can actually achieve, or is there a cost-effective version?
Sure. And I think maybe being an engineer is you also can start to see where technology gets cheaper, and you can identify technologies that are getting more cost-effective and are going to be able to be implemented on farms. So for me, that's one of the really interesting things about going to like engineering conferences and expos and National Farm Machinery Show, some of these places where we see technology being displayed, and we can almost see it coming down the pipeline where farmers are going to be able to use it. And that's one of the really neat things about that intersection for me.
Yeah, and that's where I got some of the drone work came from. So I saw, we're seeing this drones in pastures or in the fields in the crop production. And you say, if that was used in pasture, imagine how much time you could save. If we're using that to monitor livestock, wow, wouldn't that be amazing? And so just seeing that and knowing that that's a technology we need to be evaluating for the future. That's where that impetus for some of that grant came from. And also was just trying to find an easier way to check cows. Yeah. If you go out there at night, and so I've told this story before, where you trying to find black cows at night is a challenge, especially this time of year when it's 5 o'clock and it's pitch black dark. Mm-hmm. And so nothing makes me more frustrated. I hate the time change. I absolutely positively hate the time change. That's neither here nor there, I know. But
you're not going to be able to petition someone via the podcast to get them to change back to daylight savings for you, I guess.
But it's what we have to deal with. So with the environment we have and the situation that we have, what can we do? And so the drone was kind of one option we came up with as an option, not just for myself, for other producers. If they do allow beyond visual line of sight or completely automated flights to be performed, this would be a potential game changer in my mind for producers. And then if you get a swarm of drones out there checking animals, then it can become even more dynamic. So there's a lot of stuff I see even in the future, a lot of stuff we still need to work on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's absolutely stuff that's coming down the pipeline. I think that is a perfect example. And more people have drones. So the potential and the cost on them and the precision that you get with the cameras on them continues to get much better. So I think you're absolutely correct. I think people are going to be able to start using some technologies that maybe in the past were either too expensive or didn't work well enough, and they've just been able to fine-tune things to a point where they can be used.
And that's the one thing, battery technology is even improving. So if they keep improving at the rate they are now, we could be talking 40, 50-minute flights easily. And so, for some of the more commercially available drones. Yeah. And so there are some bigger drones which are able to achieve that kind of flight time. So, getting that flight time, being able to observe the animals for long periods of time, very, very big game changer in my mind, especially if you're observing beef cattle, which are spread out over the entire farm, it can seem like sometimes.
That's pretty cool. So let me just follow up with one more question about being both a farmer and an engineer. What do you think, what would you describe yourself as first, and what would you describe yourself as second?
In an ideal world, to be a farmer first, but that's not really what pays the bills, I guess. So it's, I guess I'd be a farmer first, but then I want to use engineering solutions to help myself get things done on the farm. So farmer first, but also I realize that engineering is what can actually help me get a lot of things done more effectively on the farm.
I think that's interesting. So you now have how many brothers that are engineers?
I have, and that's the other thing, I guess. I have two other brothers who are engineers. So both of them went through the program before me. One was kind of concurrent.
Okay.
And so we were able to, they went through the program, ag engineering, biosystems, ag engineering before I did. And so I was able to say, yeah, it looks like it could be a lot of good opportunities and opens a lot of doors. And just some of those, I remember I was really interested in Bernoulli one of the first equations I think that was probably most applicable to me was Bernoulli's equation. So that's just, the flow of water, getting that sizing waters and pipes and pumps.
Okay.
Probably most effective.
That's what really sort of brought you into
That's what really,
engineering.
nail in the coffin for animal science was that Bernoulli's equation,
It all made sense after that, huh? I don't know if everyone would agree with you. Anyone who's taken a fluids class might disagree with you on that. That might not have been their most favorite part of engineering, but I would agree. I think that it sometimes engineering, because it's an applied science, sometimes if you already have the background in that scientific field, the application of some of these equations and the approaches that engineering uses, I think a lot of times for people that already know what it's like to experience something, when they come into an engineering program, they come in and they really gain out of seeing some of these equations in a way that someone who maybe doesn't have that practical experience, doesn't understand how valuable those equations are. It's sort of tricky. A lot of times we have a lot of students right now that want practical experience because they don't come in with it. Farmers come in with a lot of practical experience, and they maybe see the value in the theoretical in those equations more so than someone who hasn't seen on farm what a missized water line looks like.
Or that, that's just the challenge is if you have such a small water line, it's hard for all the cows to get around there and drink at once. And so you understand the practical considerations. So then you coming back and learning about, the pipe sizing and flow rates and the pump sizing, it all helps connect it together in my mind.
That's really cool. I think that's really a neat approach. And we're going to talk next time about my background, which is going to be almost the inverse of yours. So it'll be kind of interesting for people to hear the two stories back to back. We're going to end today, but I think maybe because we're still pre-recording these and we don't know what's happening exactly on the farm, we're going to maybe skip over what we're planning to do next week because it's going to be a little bit of a toss-up based upon weather, at least for me.
It'd probably still be kind of the same, fencing and just managing the cattle.
There you go. I think we'll be managing cattle too. We've got to keep them fed somehow. So with that, we'll end for the day, and we appreciate you guys joining us.
Thank you.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.